Chag Pesach Sameach, Shabbat Shalom, say it in Yiddish, Good Shabbos, Zisen Pesach, say Moedim L'Simcha. There's many greetings for today. Liberalism is on the defense these days. I'm not talking about the Liberal Party, although maybe they're getting a bad rap, or maybe it's deserved. I don't want to get into party politics. That's what the Kiddush is for. And I'm not talking about what we usually mean by liberalism. If you watch, CNN or whatever, and they're talking about the liberals, or Fox News, and they're talking about the liberals, the slightly left-wing politics. No, what I mean by liberalism, the ideas of the Enlightenment, the ideas of liberty and equality, the rights of freedom of speech and religion, civil rights for minorities, universal human rights, democratic governments, free inquiry, maybe even weighing facts and using reason as a way to make a decision. Liberalism is getting a bad rap these days. Around the world, strongman populism is spreading on the right and also sometimes on the left. The virtues of liberalism, of reason, equality of individuals, rule of law, are giving way to leaders claiming to have all the answers, zero-sum thinking between cultural groups and nations, no trust in institutions or media, maybe even oligarchs taking over, corruption. For some on the right, one is not an individual, one is a member of a nation or a race. For some on the left, one is not an individual, one is a member of an identity, ethnic or sexual or a class identity. The similarity is that it is always my group that is persecuted, and the system, the liberal order, cannot help, or maybe it's to blame. We have to overthrow it to return to the days of the glorious past, as some on the right say. Or we have to overthrow it to return to the days of, or to create a new dawn in the future, some on the left might say. Canada might be a beacon of light right now, but don't think it can't happen here. For the last 200 years or so, religions have been adapting to liberalism and the societies governing themselves by liberalism's ideas. The writer Nathan Shields on the website Mosaic, an interesting Jewish website, commenting on an anti-liberal strain in contemporary Catholicism, writes, "In liberal thought, liberty means primarily freedom to choose, freedom from constraint, freedom from coercion. It is thus morally neutral. Since the purpose of the state is, at bottom, to guarantee the liberty of its subjects, the state must remain agnostic regarding competing conceptions of the good life. It cannot, for example, legislate in favor of the moral code of Christians without impinging upon the liberty of atheists or Zoroastrians. This requirement of moral neutrality is captured in John Stuart Mill's famous harm principle. The only purpose for which power can be rightly exercised over any member of a civilized community against his will is to prevent harm to others. His own good, either physical or moral, is not a sufficient warrant." This was a big change for classical religions. As the classic aphorism explaining liberalism says, "The freedom to swing my fist ends where your nose begins." The state protects individuals' rights to life and liberty, but it cannot tell you what you are obligated to do towards your neighbor, only what you can't do. This idea, this governing principle, has brought a lot to us. I'm guessing a lot of our parents, our grandparents, our great-grandparents, maybe even some of us, came to Canada or the United States for this freedom. But as I said, religions, including Judaism, had to change a little bit because of it. Freedom. Here we are at Pesach, Zman Cherutenu, the season of our freedom. But is the classical Jewish notion of freedom the same as the classical liberal notion of freedom? No, it's not. 20th century Orthodox Rabbi Eliyahu Dessler writes, "The ancient rabbis defined freedom as occupying oneself with Torah. At Pesach, we celebrate the freedom from slavery. We were Avdei Pharaoh. We were slaves to Pharaoh. But the Jewish notion of freedom is to be, the classical Jewish notion of freedom is to be an Eved Hashem, a slave, we don't like to say slave, but a servant of God." Back to Dessler. The words of God were engraved on the stone tablets. Engraved in Hebrew is charut. Freedom in Hebrew is a very similar word, cherut. This is the proof text. It is by no means merely a play on words. But what does it mean? And why do they say occupying oneself with Torah rather than learning Torah? The stone tablets on which the commandments were engraved symbolize the heart of Israel. Ideally, Torah has to be engraved in our hearts. Torah should not merely be imposed from the outside, but it should be an integral part of the Jew's being. A person dominated by material strivings is anything but free. One devoted to Torah as the aim of their life is truly free. Being bound to Torah is to be free. Torah is our obligations to God and our obligations to each other. Torah is not about my rights, as liberalism would talk about. It's about my duties, mitzvot, my obligations. So a classical Jewish notion of freedom is that we left Egypt to be bound by something different. But, of course, this does not mean that we Jews should be against liberalism. The 19th century German Rabbi Abraham Geiger had a sermon in 1840 celebrating the admission of Jews to citizenship in his state of Prussia at the time in 1812. And he writes, "The laws protect you now even as it protects all other sons of Prussia. You have become a community, O Israel, for you have been granted space in which to move freely. You may spread out in every direction, and you are admitted to every trade and craft. You have emerged from those narrow lanes that made up your world and limited your horizon. You have gone forth into the wide avenues and into the marketplaces. You beheld the broad universe, and your eye was strengthened thereby." Here he is celebrating liberalism. Jews now have a choice, individual choices to do whatever he wants. He specifically mentions every trade and every craft. You could be part of the marketplace, part of the society outside of Jewish society. It's a great thing. He saw it as a gift from God. I don't know if he saw 200 years in advance and saw us today that we can also choose not to be Jewish. I don't know what he would say. But he saw it as a machaya, something to give us life. Another 19th century rabbi, Simcha Zissel Ziv, who lived in Lithuania, saw a way to live in the modern world by thinking about it this way. Our obligations to each other take place in the political community, out there in the wider society. And he mentions an ancient sage who, when he was walking through the marketplace, said, "How grateful I am that all these people are serving me." As Ziv says, you might think of this as this ancient sage as being egotistical, but really no, what he's talking about is, look, the grocer over there is feeding me. The shoemaker there is making shoes so I can have them. The tailor, the whatever, we're part of this huge web of humanity. So simple as if Zisl says, think about this as our obligations to each other within the market. The grocer is obligated to feed. The tailor is obligated to clothe. The banker is obligated to help people start businesses. It's not about individuals doing what they do for their betterment. It's about obligation. It's a little bit of our modern world, a little bit of liberalism, a little bit of Judaism integrating together, the way we think about it. So the 20th century Rabbi Eugene Borowitz, writing about this integration, writing about the autonomy we have because of the modern world, because of liberalism, the choices we have as individual citizens, as Jews, means that we can walk away from Judaism. So he writes, autonomy, however, strikes at the very heart of classic Jewish faith. God, not the self, gives law. If then modernity instructs the Jew to contravene what the sages of our day declare to be Torah, then the observant Jew will reject the blandishments of the philosophy of autonomy. For a minority of Jews, freedom within Torah remains the only way one can continue to be faithful to the covenant. The overwhelming majority of Jews, convinced by the spiritual benefits of emancipation, of liberalism, have sought some way of accommodating to it, and thus to its emphasis on freedom. Rather than reason guiding the self, the individual stands in intimate relationship to God, and from that, or from the tradition that, or the teachers who authentically articulate the consequences of this relationship, the individual discovers what must be done. Because of liberalism, we recognize that we are individuals. We are free individuals who make our own choices. But Judaism teaches us that we're bound to the Torah, that we're an Eved Hashem, a servant of God. So when we make our individual choices, we think about how are we in relationship to God at this choice? When I make this choice, is it a choice for holiness, or is it just a choice for self-aggrandizement? Is it a choice for justice? Is it a choice to walk in the path of God? Because we are free in the liberal sense today, free to do what we want, to live how we want, we can be free in the Jewish sense, free to live goodness and virtue, free to choose to walk in the path of God, free to bring justice and love into the world. Liberalism, as I said, is getting a bad rap. But liberalism, the ideas of equality, of choice, of freedom, are what lets us as Jews thrive today. Shabbat Shalom, Chag Sameach.